Mr. Brock, got to ask you, a public inquiry, there seems to be almost a deal between the parties for a public inquiry. Any idea if that would happen? What would it entail? We're just asking, you know.
I wish I knew.
Yeah?
I wish I knew. We've been asking the government to call it at the very least. We've submitted, as far as I understand, we've submitted some nonpartisan names for consideration to head up the inquiry, but the government has an onus to actually call it. Okay, so we're hoping that happens today, this being the last sitting day.
Calling it in which way? Like standing up, like in a motion of closure, say we're going to adjourn for the summer, by the way, we're calling a...
Well, let's take a look at the language the government has used so far. Using language such as it's never been off the table and we're going to consider it, we're waiting for the opposition to sit down and work together, we want to work collaboratively, but the government still has an onus to call, to physically, legally call for a public inquiry.
Marc stands up this afternoon and puts it in his motion of closure.
Precisely. We've asked for this. We've asked for this daily. It hasn't happened. Today's the day, hopefully.
Is there anything particular you want to see in it? That's on your wish list? Because everybody's got a wish list.
Yes. We want pure openness, okay? Full transparency, full accountability, no hiding behind staffers who didn't deliver a message or should have delivered a message. We want the particular justice who is appointed to lead this inquiry to be having full access to all confidential memos, all confidential cabinet secrets, whatever they may be. Lay it all out in front of the inquiry. Make it public, make it accountable.
Because the goal is to figure out what's happening with foreign interference versus the parties fighting amongst each other.
You have to understand the true breadth of the problem before you can offer a solution.
Thank you for stopping. Good to see you.
Okay, good to see you again.
Yeah.
Oh, excuse-moi, j'ai...
Ouais, est-ce qu'on est prêt pour les vacances?
J'ai aucune idée. J'ai aucune idée. Mais pour moi, si on va avoir une journée de l'opposition, je pense que ça démontre, c'est bon augure.
Une enquête publique, là, est-ce que ça va vraiment aider à nettoyer le linge sale en famille?
Bien, écoutez, moi, je veux dire non, pas effectivement. Moi, je pense que le rapport de M. Johnston était vraiment plein de bons conseils. Effectivement. Alors, on va avoir... j'assume, je présume, en lisant vos articles, on va avoir une enquête publique. Et si on va faire ça, c'est beau, mais quand même, il va y avoir des choses qu'on ne peut pas partager avec le grand public. Alors, il va y avoir une partie de cette enquête publique qui va passer en privé, à huis clos. Et c'est normal, parce qu'on veut protéger nos sources, on veut protéger les informations qu'on reçoit de nos partenaires, nos alliés, et c'est important de le faire.
Est-ce qu'on ne se serait pas, du côté des libéraux, épargné beaucoup de troubles si on était juste allé en enquête publique tout de suite en partant?
Effectivement. Et puis, je pense que c'est plus facile à passer à une enquête publique, mais enquête publique avec des astérix à côté de ça, en disant que ça va être une enquête publique comme toutes les autres enquêtes publiques.
Mais le Bloc a dit aujourd'hui que les discussions sont pas mal positives. Est-ce que vous avez entendu quelque chose?
Non, moi, j'ai entendu la même chose en parlant de mes collègues, en parlant avec, et quand je dis collègues, mes collègues parlementaires de tous les partis. Moi, je suis membre du comité permanent sur l'éthique, puis aussi sur les affaires procédurales. Alors, j'ai la chance de parler avec mes collègues du Bloc, du Parti conservateur, du Parti NPD. Il semble que les discussions vont bon train.
Alors, pensez qu'on va entendre quelque chose, aujourd'hui, demain?
Je ne peux pas prédire parce qu'il y a beaucoup de place entre la coupe et l'élève. Hein? Alors, il faut attendre jusqu'à un moment qu'on va avoir une annonce.
Okay.
Merci, M. Fergus.
Est-ce que ça vous aide?
Ben oui,
super.
Ça nuit pas.
Merci.
Thank you for this morning. Anything changes? Anything new? Given on the...
Well, the Coast Guard ship John Cabot is now on site with its advanced sonar equipment. So, of course, as you know, we are in part of the Joint Command led by the U.S. Coast Guard. The sounds that have been heard have helped us narrow the search area. But the search is ongoing, and so, of course, until it's completed, I'm thinking very much about the families and the people involved in the submersible having gone astray. So.
Thank you very much for that. Is there any other Coast Guard ships that are still, or the Glace Bay, or anyone that seems to be close to the area that will come on site soon?
Glace Bay is on its way as well, and they have a hyperbaric chamber on board and dive experts to assist, and as well the two other Coast Guard ships. One is the Anne Harvey, and the other is the Terry Fox, CCGS Terry Fox, are on their way there, on their way back. They were in St. John's to be porting equipment out, and they are both on their way to the site.
Any word on the sea state? I mean, almost all these ships you're mentioning are medium to large size, are icebreakers.
Yeah.
Are things bouncy at this point? I mean, it's North Atlantic.
We had an update by the U.S. Coast Guard to my staff, and but there was no mention of the weather conditions or the water conditions. So I'm not hearing that is a constraint as it was in the beginning.
Great. Thank you very much for stopping. Good to see you.
Today is Indigenous Peoples Day, and I'm so proud to be here with my good colleagues, Lori Idlout from Nunavut and Blake Desjarlais from Edmonton, Griesbach, the NDP Indigenous Caucus, to say very clearly, we are still here, we are strong, we are resistant, and we are beautiful, and we are loved people with rich histories in this place that is now many refer to as Canada. And we have had an opportunity since being elected members of Parliament to push forward issues impacting the rights of Indigenous peoples, all Indigenous peoples. And as the critic for women and gender equality, one of the issues that I've put forward is issues around the ongoing genocide of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Last month, the House unanimously supported a motion recognizing the crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls as a Canada-wide emergency. We are going to continue to call on this government to implement the calls for justice of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, something that the CBC report card gave them a failing grade. Only 2 of the 231 calls to justice have been implemented to date. I also want to make note of the report that came out from the special interlocutor who is responsible for overseeing the path forward for the unmarked graves. What happened in Kamloops is an act of vicious racism, an act of hate. This kind of residential school denialism needs to end in this country. I support the special interlocutor's call, along with my NDP colleagues, that legal mechanisms are required to address this issue. That is why I, along with the NDP caucus, is looking at legal mechanisms and legislative tools that we can implement to ensure that survivors are protected. Survivors deserve peace. Survivors deserve protection. Those of us who have intergenerational impacts deserve protection. Our communities deserve protection, and we will continue to pursue that going forward.
Udlumit no nakakak si mayok tigot udluget tidligot aksaro upigibak katakwa makikatigigakit. It truly is an honor to stand with my Indigenous caucus, with the NDP, today to raise awareness about the importance of Indigenous Peoples Day. Today I wanted to highlight how important it is that we continue to pressure the government on the lack of investments that they've had for housing in the Arctic. I'm still frequently hearing from my constituents about the overcrowded housing situation that they're forced to continue to live in, as well as the moldy housing conditions that they're forced to live in. All too often I hear about multiple families, multiple generations living in one house. All too often I hear about how many years families have been forced to live in moldy housing conditions, leading to many health issues like the spread of tuberculosis and all those kinds of many other mental health issues that lead to the well-being of our peoples in the Arctic. So today I call upon the government to continue to make sure that there is sustainable long-term housing funding for the territories, for Nunavut, for NWT, and the Yukon, because we need to make sure that while the EARN funding was announced, we need to make sure that there's also housing for the territories. Koyanami.
Tansei friends, Blake Desjarlais, Nisigasun, Pakchahansei, Miskuchi, Waskayagan, Otsenia, Otapemisuaknia. First of all, I want to just mention how incredible today is to be able to stand here amongst a caucus of New Democratic colleagues that are Indigenous. It hasn't been all that long ago that Canada has been a place where this kind of reality of representation was absent. And as Indigenous members of Parliament, as we continue to navigate this space and continue to advocate on behalf of our communities, there are issues that are present to not just Indigenous people, but other folks as well, and there's a conflation oftentimes of some of these realities. And I want to speak about one of the realities facing Indigenous people in urban centres. I represent an urban centre known as Edmonton-Griesba. It has one of the poorest communities in Canada. At one point, we were famous for having the largest rate of poverty amongst children. So representing a community like that, we hear time and time again, particularly where I'm from in the inner city of Edmonton and the Northeast, we're seeing a massive increase in poverty. And the result of that poverty is Indigenous lives are put at risk. In Edmonton today, 58% of people who are houseless are Indigenous. This is a growing trend right across the country. We're seeing Indigenous people facing poverty, whether it's in their reserve or on their Métis settlements, being forced into urban centres. But when they get to those urban centres, they find that they're even further behind. They find that they can't find the means to get the support they need. They can't navigate their intergenerational trauma in the way that it is supported and holistic, nor can they even find the means to eat. These are community members that are being tossed out and left in our cities right now. There needs to be a strategy to ensure that urban housing for Indigenous people is truly heeded and called for. There also needs to be a process by the government laid out in a way as to how and when the funding for the urban rural Indigenous funding under the EARN program actually works for cities. It is no question that as time continues, we will lose lives. A winter is coming, and right now Canadians are enjoying a fantastic summer, and they're probably seeing that poverty is hurting them. But the reality is, winter is coming, and this strategy needs teeth now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Métis story is one of resistance and resilience. In recent years, we've been writing a new chapter to our story with Canada based on reconciliation. Today, with the introduction of this bill into Parliament, we hope to solidify the recognition for which we have been fighting for generations. This bill provides the legislative cradle or the architecture for our Métis governments to finally be recognized by Canada on a nation-to-nation, government-to-government basis. This is the recognition that our Métis citizens and our communities here in Ontario and across the West have been fighting for 200 years. For more than 200 years, the Crown's approach to our assertions was to deny and to ignore them. When the Crown did make bargains with our ancestors, those promises were quickly broken. But we never relented because the Métis are an incredibly resilient people. It has been more than 40 years since Section 35 of the Constitution was established, recognizing and affirming the Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, which expressly included the Métis peoples. From the failed constitutional conferences in the 1980s, to the Métis Nation Accord being rejected as part of the Charlottetown Accord in the 1990s, to the Kelowna Accord in 2015, we have been so close to having our self-government recognized in federal law, only to have politics overtake promises or principles. This legislation will ensure that even as governments come and go, the recognition of our Métis self-government will not be subject to political change. And this legislation will constitutionally protect the agreement we are currently negotiating with Canada as a modern-day self-government treaty. I want to thank Minister Miller, thank you, Minister, and the current federal government led by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for doing what governments in the past tried to do with the Métis, but were unable to complete. And we are delighted to see all parties united today in the House of Commons in support of this historic piece of legislation. This year marks the Supreme Court of Canada's landmark Powley decision's 20th anniversary, which remains foundational for Métis rights assertions across the Métis Nation homeland. That was in that decision the Supreme Court directed governments to do this for now decades. It's fitting that this legislation is introduced on National Indigenous Peoples Day, and we hope it will be passed in this year, 2023. We've been working hard with the government to co-develop our self-government agreements and this legislation. Now it's in the hands of Parliament. We've heard apologies for historic wrongs. We have seen a growing appreciation for the role of Indigenous peoples as partners in Confederation. We have read the findings of the report on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and we have heard the calls to action from the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. All of this indicates that reconciliation with all of Canada's Indigenous peoples is Parliament's goal. Passing this legislation will be reconciliation in action. Passing this legislation will advance the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in a concrete and a practical way. Today, we're calling on Parliament to support this important legislation. Instead of being known as the forgotten people, the Métis will finally be recognized as an equal order of government alongside other self-governing First Nations and Inuit. Let's end the centuries-old legacy of ignoring the Métis and denying our rights as an Indigenous people. We urge every member of Parliament and Senator to move as swiftly as possible to make this legislation law. Thank you. Merci.
Tansei, Lanate, bonjour, and good afternoon. It's fitting that this legislation is introduced on this day, the day of the recognition of National Indigenous Peoples Day. I want to acknowledge my colleagues, leaders from other provinces, of course, Margaret Froh, President of the Métis Nation of Ontario, Audrey Poitras, President of the Métis Nation Alberta. We can truly achieve so much more when we work together. I also wanted to acknowledge the leadership that Minister Miller has shown and the Government of Canada to bring this legislation to fruition. The introduction of our legislation is another step in a journey that has, as Margaret said, has been over 200 years of fighting, and with strong leaders. For decades, leaders from Saskatchewan have been traveling to the unceded Anishinaabe and Algonquin territory here in Ottawa to fight for our rights. This struggle is one all Indigenous people face, and standing here today, I want to affirm that we must all stand together, support one another, and ensure that we all take our rightful place in Canadian society. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people must stand together. The idea of taking our right place is something that our late leader, Jim Sinclair, fiercely believed. In fact, during the constitutional talks in 1987, he said There are some people who are genuine, who want to make a deal, who want to see our people take their rightful place in society, and we hope that this legislation is the beginning of that. Jim, Harry Daniels, and many other Métis leaders spent their lives fighting for our people and for our rights. And I want to acknowledge that the introduction of this legislation could not have happened without the dedication and sacrifice that these leaders made. The introduction of this bill shows the support that we have with elected leaders in Canada to recognize our people and to establish the nation-to-nation relationship we have been seeking for generations. This is reconciliation in action. It's the first important step going forward. And at each stage of this bill's journey, through the Canadian system, we hope that parliamentarians will continue to practice reconciliation or reconciliation. The Métis Nation Saskatchewan has been working on self-governance for many years. Some of our elders say our inherent right doesn't come from Parliament, it comes from the Creator. And we continue to practice our inherent rights to self-government and to our communities. We continue to build a strong governance system through our Métis Nation Legislative Assembly, through our Provincial Métis Council, through our local community leaders, grassroots leaders. As this bill moves forward, we are grateful for the support from all of our leaders, and we have some of our leaders here today from Saskatchewan, and we're grateful. To the citizens of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan, I stand here committed to advancing our rights. I stand here committed to the building of a strong and robust governance. And I stand here committed to our people and future generations of Métis across Saskatchewan. As I said in the beginning, when we work together, we can accomplish great things. And we will need every citizen as we move forward to embark on the future envisioned by our ancestors. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I want to take a moment to honor Louis Riel and the dreams he passed on to every Métis person. History books focus on the battles, but Louis Riel always tried to work with and through the government first. He petitioned the government. He drafted bills, including a Bill of Rights. He was the founder of Manitoba as a province and played an important role in Confederation. He was elected as a member of Parliament by his people 3 times, and yet he was never permitted to take his rightful seat in the House of Commons. I thought about that today as I took my seat in the gallery and I watched this incredibly important bill be introduced. All my life, I've heard about Louis Riel's visions and the dreams of generations of Métis to have our inherent right of self-government recognized by Canada. Riel taught us never to give up, and now look where we are. Our Métis ancestors were determined to govern themselves and to protect our traditions, our values, and truth for generations to come. They fought back against Canada's expansionist agenda, as well as a fraudulent scrip system that dispossessed our families and communities of our lands. And they defended Métis identity, lands, our way of life, and our rights. Over the generations, the Crown made promises to our ancestors, and those promises were quickly broken, and our rights were denied and ignored. Nevertheless, we did what we needed to do to keep our communities, and our nationhood alive. We built our self-government structures through coming together in assemblies, democratic elections, and by sheer force of will. And while we did not have much in those days, we always had each other. Today, the Métis Nation of Alberta is a democratic Métis government that represents over 61,000 registered citizens. We continue to come together to defend Métis lands, rights, and to advance our collective interests. And we have built a province-wide service delivery system to help meet the needs of our people. Yet, we have always struggled to have our Métis government recognized by Canada. Today, we're very happy. We are calling on all parliamentarians to support this important legislation. This historic step forward is long overdue. Passing this legislation into law is reconciliation in action. As President Froh said, ours is a story of resistance and resilience. Our Section 35 rights as Indigenous people are not a zero-sum game. The advancement of self-government and Section 35 rights of one nation does not come at the expense of any other Indigenous nation. We know that when one nation advances, it sets the path for all of us to move forward. The same is true for the Métis Nation today. We deserve to advance in reconciliation, just like all other Indigenous nations. To finally end Canada's legacy of ignoring the Métis and denying our rights as an Indigenous people, Parliament must now pass this legislation. We can't wait any longer. Thank you.
Bonjour, Tanse. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I first want to say what a great day it is to be Métis in this country, and what a great day, by extension, it means to be Indigenous in this country. And I think everyone should turn their eyes to the strong leadership that's behind me, with the Vice President, President Caron, and Presidents Poitras and Froh, who have put so much work into making this day a reality, to do something very basic, which is recognize an inherent right to govern yourselves. I do want to acknowledge our presence on the territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I'll make some brief remarks and then perhaps turn it over to questions. Moments ago, we introduced a bill in the House of Commons to recognize that very basic right, the right of the Métis people in Saskatchewan, in Ontario, and in Alberta to govern themselves, an inherent right to self-government. We're working with Métis to advance their priorities on reconciliation and renew those relationships and build a better future for the benefit of their citizens and all Canadians. This bill advances Métis self-government in partnership with the Métis Nation of Ontario, as I mentioned earlier, Saskatchewan and Alberta. Ce projet de loi donne suite aux engagements pris dans les ententes individuelles de reconnaissance signées plus tôt cette année et de mise en œuvre de l'autonomie gouvernementale qui ont été élaborées conjointement avec les gouvernements métis concernés. Par ce projet de loi, et comme le prévoient les ententes, le Canada reconnaît officiellement que chacun de ces gouvernements métis est le gouvernement représentatif de ses citoyens et de ses collectivités. Our government also recognizes that each of the Métis collectivities have an inherent right to self-government that is recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution Act, a very basic right that's been denied for far too long. And we recognize that they have jurisdiction over their own core governance matters, their own citizenship, internal administration, and leadership selection. When this bill passes, the next step will be to negotiate a self-government treaty with each of the Métis governments. Essentially, this bill creates a clear legal framework for putting these agreements into effect, and I encourage all parliamentarians to come together to consider the bill and work together to pass it to meet our collective goal of advancing reconciliation. And I recognize my Conservative colleague here today that is fighting for this as well. Il s'agit d'un événement clé de l'engagement du Canada à faire progresser le travail avec les partenaires Métis pour mettre en œuvre la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones. Article 4 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which we will be speaking for and about in the next few minutes, states clearly Indigenous peoples in exercising their right to self-determination have the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs, as well as ways and means for financing their autonomous functions. This is true regardless of whether you are First Nation, Inuit, or Métis. And it's a key step to realizing their visions to self-determination and a better future for the communities and citizens that they serve. I want to thank the leaderships of MNO, MNS, and MNA and their teams for their hard work. A number of them you see today, as well as the youth standing in the background, looking really proud. Your openness, your patience, and your collaboration for the co-development that we've worked on together. You've advocated tirelessly to ensure that every parliamentarian and senator was well engaged leading up to the introduction and demonstrating your extreme commitment to yourselves and to the people that you serve. Je suis heureux de travailler à vos côtés. Je me réjouis du travail à venir. I'll now turn it over for questions. Merci. Thank you et merci.